Barcelona in 1870, A City in Transformation, a complete documentary. Chapter 1, The Political Landscape in Historical Context, The Winds of Revolution. The year 1870 found Barcelona at a pivotal crossroads in Spanish and Catalan history. The city existed within a nation convulsing with political upheaval, caught in the turbulent period known as the Sexenio Democrático, or the Democratic 6 Years, which had begun with the Glorious Revolution of September 1868. Just 2 years before 1870, Queen Isabella II had been overthrown and forced into exile in France. The revolution that toppled her had been orchestrated by a coalition of progressive liberals, Democrats, and military leaders who had grown weary of her authoritarian and scandal-ridden reign. General Juan Prim, Admiral Juan Bautista Topete, and General Francisco Serrano had led the uprising that would fundamentally reshape Spain's political trajectory. Barcelona had played a significant role in these revolutionary events. The city's population, long frustrated by Madrid's centralist policies and the economic constraints imposed by the crown, had welcomed the revolution with considerable enthusiasm. The workers in the textile factories, the merchants along the port, and the intellectuals in the cafes had all shared a vision of greater liberty, economic reform, and regional autonomy. A nation searching for a king. In 1870, Spain found itself in the peculiar position of being a monarchy without a monarch. The provisional government, led by General Serrano as regent, was actively searching for a suitable candidate to assume the Spanish throne. This search would have far-reaching consequences, extending well beyond Spain's borders. The candidacy of Leopold of Hohenzollerns, Sigmaringen for the Spanish throne became one of the most explosive diplomatic issues of the era. France, under Napoleon III, viewed the prospect of a German prince on Spain's throne with alarm, fearing encirclement by Prussian influence. This diplomatic crisis would ultimately contribute to the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War in July 1870, a conflict that would reshape the European balance of power. For Barcelona's citizens, these distant political machinations had immediate practical implications. Trade with France, always vital to the Catalan economy, faced disruption. The textile industry, dependent on imported cotton and access to European markets, experienced uncertainty. Merchants and industrialists gathered in the exchange houses along the Ramblas, anxiously discussing the implications of each new dispatch from Madrid, Paris, and Berlin. Republican sentiments and federal dreams. Barcelona in 1870 harbored strong Republican and Federalist sentiments. While much of Spain debated which royal house should provide the next king, many Catalans questioned whether Spain needed a king at all. The Federal Republican movement had found fertile ground in Catalonia, attracting workers, intellectuals, and progressive members of the middle class. Francesc Pierre Margall, the Catalan philosopher and politician, had become the intellectual father of Spanish federalism. His vision of a Spain organized as a federation of autonomous regions resonated deeply with Catalans, who had long chafed under Bourbon centralism. The cafes of Barcelona buzzed with discussions of his ideas, with workers and bourgeois alike debating the merits of a federal republic. The Federal Republican Party had established strong organizations in Barcelona's neighborhoods. In the Raval, in Barceloneta, in the old quarters of the Gothic district, Republican clubs met regularly to discuss politics, organize mutual aid societies, and plan for a future they believed was within reach. The military presence. Despite the revolutionary fervor, Barcelona remained under close military supervision. The citadel, that hated symbol of Bourbon repression built after the city's defeat in 1714, still dominated the eastern edge of the old city. Though discussions had begun about demolishing this fortress and reclaiming the land for civilian use, in 1870 it remained an active military installation, a constant reminder of Madrid's authority over the Catalan capital. The Captain General of Catalonia wielded enormous power, capable of suspending civil liberties and imposing martial law whenever political tensions threatened to boil over. This military presence created a peculiar duality in Barcelona's daily life, where revolutionary newspapers operated alongside military patrols, where workers organized unions while authorities watched nervously. Chapter 2, The Urban Landscape and Architecture. Breaking free from the walls. Perhaps nothing better symbolized Barcelona's transformation in 1870 than the ongoing demolition of the medieval walls that had confined the city for centuries. The process had begun in 1854, when the Spanish government finally authorized what Barcelonans had long demanded: the destruction of the fortifications that had become an intolerable constraint on the growing city. By 1870, much of this demolition work had been completed, though rubble and construction projects still marked the former line of the walls. Where stone ramparts had stood, new avenues were emerging. The Ronda de Saint-Père, the Ronda de Saint-Antoine, and other ring roads were taking shape, creating broad boulevards where narrow gates had once controlled all movement in and out of the city. The removal of the walls was more than a practical matter of urban expansion. It represented liberation from centuries of military domination. The walls had been maintained not primarily to defend Barcelona from foreign enemies, but to control its population, to ensure that the Catalan capital could be easily suppressed should it rebel against the Spanish crown. Their destruction marked the beginning of a new era. The example, a vision of the future. The most ambitious urban project in Barcelona's history was taking its first tentative steps in 1870. The example, or extension, was the revolutionary urban plan designed by the engineer Ildefons Cerda and approved against fierce local opposition by the Spanish government in 1859. Cerda had envisioned a radically new kind of city. His plan called for a vast grid of streets extending from the old city toward the surrounding villages of Gracia, Sant Andreu, Sants, and Le Cour. Each block in this grid would measure 113.3 meters on each side, with chamfered corners that created distinctive octagonal intersections designed to improve visibility and traffic flow. By 1870, construction in the example had begun but remained limited. The financial crisis of the late 1860s, the political instability of the revolutionary period, and the sheer scale of the project meant that much of Cerda's planned extension remained agricultural land, dotted with the occasional new building rising incongruously among the vegetable gardens and orchards. The blocks that had been completed showed the promise of Cerda's vision, though developers had already begun to deviate from his original plans. Where Cerda had envisioned buildings occupying only two sides of each block, with large interior gardens open to the public, property owners were constructing on all sides, maximizing their rental income at the expense of green space and ventilation. The Old City, a medieval labyrinth. Within the former walls, the Old City presented a dramatically different environment from the orderly grid rising beyond them. The Barri Gothic, the Raval, and the Ribera Quarter formed a dense labyrinth of narrow streets, many so confined that neighbors could shake hands across the gap from their balconies. These ancient quarters housed the majority of Barcelona's population in 1870. The buildings rose 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories high, blocking sunlight from streets that might be only 2 or 3 meters wide. Ventilation was poor, sanitation worse. The city's limited sewer system emptied into the port, creating a constant stench along the waterfront. Yet these crowded quarters also pulsed with life. The ground floors housed workshops, taverns, bakeries, and shops of every description. Artisans practiced their trades as their ancestors had for generations. Street vendors cried their wares at all hours. The sounds of hammers, looms, children playing and neighbors arguing merged into a constant urban symphony. The Ramblas, Barcelona's artery. The Ramblas served as Barcelona's main promenade and public gathering space in 1870. This tree-lined boulevard, running from the port to the Plaça de Catalunya, had been created in the 18th century along the course of an ancient, seasonal riverbed. By 1870, it had become the heart of Barcelona's social life. During the evening passeig, or promenade, Barcelonans of all classes strolled along the central pedestrian walkway. Wealthy families displayed their finest clothes. Workers sought entertainment after long days in the factories. Students debated politics. Couples courted under the watchful eyes of chaperones. The Ramblas was also a center of commerce and culture. The Boqueria market, housed in a magnificent iron structure completed in 1840, offered the bounty of Catalonia: fresh fish from the Mediterranean, vegetables from the farms of the Llobregat Valley, meats, cheeses, and wines from throughout the region. Nearby, the Liceu Opera House, rebuilt after a fire in 1862, provided a venue for the cultural ambitions of Barcelona's bourgeoisie, port, and industry. Barcelona's port in 1870 was undergoing significant expansion. The ancient harbor, protected by a breakwater, handled an increasing volume of trade as the city's industries grew. Sailing ships still predominated, their masts creating a forest of wood and canvas visible from the end of the Ramblas, but steamships were becoming increasingly common. The port area was rough and cosmopolitan. Sailors from around the Mediterranean and beyond filled the taverns of Barceloneta, the fishing village that had been built on reclaimed land in the 18th century. The narrow streets near the water housed a transient population of dock workers, fishermen, sailors between voyages, and those who made their living serving them. Chapter 3: Economy and Industry. The textile capital of Spain. Barcelona in 1870 had earned its reputation as the Manchester of the Mediterranean. The textile industry, particularly cotton manufacturing, dominated the city's economy and shaped its social structure. Steam-powered factories had transformed production in the decades before 1870, concentrating workers in large industrial establishments that marked a decisive break from the artisanal workshops of earlier generations. The textile factories clustered primarily in the Raval district, west of the Ramblas, and in the newer industrial areas along the rivers flowing down from the Collserola hills. The morning and evening hours saw streams of workers, many of them women and children, flowing through the streets between their cramped lodgings and the factory gates. These factories produced cotton cloth for both the Spanish domestic market and export. The colonial relationship with Cuba and Puerto Rico provided guaranteed markets for Catalan textiles, though the future of these arrangements seemed increasingly uncertain as independence movements stirred in the Caribbean. Working conditions. Life inside the textile factories was harsh by any standard. Workers, including children as young as 8 or 9, labored 12, 14, even 16 hours a day. The machinery was dangerous. Accidents that maimed or killed workers were common occurrences. The air inside the factories was thick with cotton fibers that caused respiratory diseases. Wages were meager and often paid irregularly. Factory owners frequently paid their workers in scrip that could only be redeemed at company stores where prices were inflated. Workers lived in constant fear of dismissal, knowing that hundreds of unemployed hands waited eagerly to take their places. Women formed a significant portion of the textile workforce. They were paid substantially less than men for equivalent work, justified by the factory owners as appropriate given the women's supposed lesser needs and abilities. The reality was that many women were the primary or sole supporters of their families, and their wages determined whether children ate. The rise of labor organization. Barcelona in 1870 was at the forefront of the Spanish labor movement. The relative tolerance of the revolutionary government had allowed workers to organize more openly than had been possible under Isabella II. Trade unions, mutual aid societies, and worker cooperatives were proliferating throughout the industrial districts. The First International, the revolutionary workers' organization led by Karl Marx and others, had established a Spanish section in 1870. Giuseppe Finelli, an Italian anarchist associated with Mikhail Bakunin, had visited Barcelona in 1868, finding enthusiastic audiences among the textile workers. By 1870, the Spanish section of the International was growing rapidly, with Barcelona as its strongest center. The debate between the followers of Marx and those of Bakunin would eventually split the Spanish labor movement. But in 1870, this division had not yet fully crystallized. Workers attended meetings where they learned about the principles of socialism, discussed strategies for improving their conditions, and dreamed of a fundamental transformation of society. Commerce and trade. Beyond the textile industry, Barcelona's economy embraced a wide range of commercial activities. The city's merchants traded throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, importing raw materials and exporting finished goods. The port handled grain from Russia, cotton from the American South and Egypt, machinery from Britain, and luxury goods from France. Banking and finance were developing to support industrial expansion. The Bank of Barcelona, established in 1844, provided credit to manufacturers and merchants. New financial institutions were emerging to serve the needs of a modernizing economy, though access to capital remained a constraint on industrial growth. The retail trade flourished along the Ramblas and in the streets of the old city. Shop owners occupied a middle position in Barcelona's social hierarchy, aspiring to bourgeois respectability while remaining closely connected to the working classes from which many had risen. Agricultural connections. Though Barcelona was increasingly industrial, it remained closely tied to its agricultural hinterland. The Catalan countryside provided much of the city's food, brought to market each morning by farmers who had traveled through the night. The wine regions of the Penedès supplied the taverns and private cellars of Barcelona. The relationship between city and countryside was changing as Barcelona grew. Young people from rural villages, unable to make a living from the land, streamed into the city seeking factory work. This rural-urban migration was transforming both Barcelona and the villages that sent their children to the urban industrial world. Chapter 4. Society in Daily Life. Class Structure. Barcelona's society in 1870 was organized along clearly defined class lines, though the boundaries between classes were more fluid than in many European cities of the era. At the top stood the grande bourgeoisie, the factory owners, major merchants, and financiers who controlled the city's economic life. These families lived in grand apartments along the Ramblas or in the newly constructed buildings of the Eixample. They socialized at the Liceu Opera House, summered at their country estates, and married within a close circle of similar families. Below them, a substantial middle class included smaller manufacturers, professionals, shopkeepers, and skilled artisans who owned their own workshops. This class was expanding as industrial growth created new opportunities for those with education, capital, or particular skills. The working class, by far the largest segment of Barcelona's population, included factory workers, construction laborers, domestic servants, and those who survived by whatever work they could find. Within the working class, significant gradations existed between relatively well-paid skilled workers and the desperate masses who crowded into the tenements of the Raval. Housing. The housing conditions of Barcelona's various classes reflected and reinforced social distinctions. The wealthy occupied spacious apartments with high ceilings, elaborate decorations, and servants' quarters tucked away in the back. Their buildings featured grand staircases, interior courtyards that provided light and air, and ornate facades that announced their owners' prosperity. Middle-class families lived more modestly, but still enjoyed separate rooms for different functions, adequate light and ventilation, and the privacy that marked respectable status. Their apartments might occupy a single floor of a building, with bedrooms, a parlor for receiving guests, and a dining room. For the working class, housing conditions were often appalling. Entire families crowded into single rooms in buildings where dozens of households shared a single privy in the courtyard. Ventilation was so poor that tuberculosis and other diseases spread rapidly. Some of the worst housing was found in the cellars and attics, spaces barely fit for human habitation, but pressed into service by the chronic housing shortage. Food and diet. The diet of Barcelona's residents varied dramatically by class. The wealthy enjoyed abundant meat, fresh fish, vegetables, and fruits, along with fine wines and imported delicacies. Their tables might feature French cuisine, reflecting the cultural influence of Barcelona's northern neighbor. The working class subsisted on a much more limited diet. Bread was the staple, supplemented by beans, vegetables when affordable, salt cod, and occasionally small amounts of meat. The women who managed working-class households demonstrated considerable skill in stretching limited budgets to feed their families, though malnutrition was common, especially among children. The markets of Barcelona provided the food supply for all classes. The Boqueria on the Ramblas was the largest and most famous. But smaller markets served neighborhoods throughout the city. Market women, often formidable figures who had worked the stalls for decades, ruled over these commercial spaces with iron authority. Religion. The Catholic Church remained a powerful presence in Barcelona's daily life, though its authority was being challenged by the currents of liberalism and secularism that flowed through the revolutionary period. The city's churches continued to fill on Sundays and feast days, and religious observances marked the major transitions of life: baptism, First Communion, marriage, and death. The church's influence extended well beyond religious services. Catholic charities provided much of what limited social welfare existed, running hospitals, orphanages, and schools. Religious orders educated the children of the wealthy, while church-sponsored schools offered basic literacy to some working-class children. Yet anti-clerical sentiment was widespread, particularly among workers and liberal intellectuals. Many associated the church with the old regime, with the monarchy, with the forces that had opposed progress and reform. The friars and priests who walked Barcelona's streets sometimes encountered hostility, a foreshadowing of the violence that would periodically erupt against religious institutions in the decades to come. Education. Barcelona in 1870 had no comprehensive system of public education. The wealthy sent their children to private academies or hired tutors. Religious orders operated schools that served middle-class families seeking respectable education for their sons and, increasingly, their daughters. For working-class children, education was a luxury that few could afford. Some attended parish schools that offered basic literacy, but many received no formal education at all. Child labor was the norm rather than the exception. Children as young as 6 or 7 might work in factories, and by 10 or 12, most working-class children were employed full-time. The illiteracy rate remained high, though it was declining as reform-minded educators, progressive municipalities, and worker organizations established new schools. The labor movement recognized education as essential to worker advancement and liberation, and many unions and cooperatives sponsored evening classes for workers eager to improve themselves. Health and medicine. Public health in Barcelona faced enormous challenges. The crowded living conditions of the old city, the inadequate water supply, and the primitive sanitation system created ideal conditions for the spread of disease. Epidemics of cholera, typhoid, and other infectious diseases periodically swept through the city, killing thousands. Medical care was available primarily to those who could pay for it. The wealthy employed private physicians and could afford the latest treatments. The poor relied on charity hospitals operated by the church or the municipality, where overcrowding and inadequate resources meant that a hospital stay could be a death sentence rather than a path to recovery. Traditional medicine and folk remedies remained common, especially among the working class. Herbalists sold their wares in the markets, midwives delivered babies and provided women's health care, and grandmothers passed down knowledge of treatments that had served their families for generations. Gender relations. Barcelona in 1870 was a patriarchal society, but one in which women played essential economic roles that sometimes contradicted the ideology of female domesticity promoted by the church and bourgeois moralists. Middle-class women were expected to devote themselves to home and family, supervising domestic servants, raising children, and managing the social obligations that marked respectable status. They were excluded from higher education, most professions, and formal political participation. Working-class women, by contrast, worked for wages out of economic necessity. They labored in the textile factories, worked as domestic servants in bourgeois households, sold goods in the markets, and took in washing, sewing, or other work that could be done at home. Their economic contributions were essential to family survival, though their wages remained a fraction of what men earned. Chapter 5. Culture, Arts, and the Renaixença. The Catalan Cultural Revival. Barcelona in 1870 was at the heart of the Renaixença, the cultural movement that sought to revive and modernize the Catalan language and literary tradition. This movement, which had begun in the 1830s and 1840s, had by 1870 grown into a powerful cultural force with significant political implications. The Renaixença drew inspiration from the medieval period when Catalonia had been an independent political entity, and Catalan had been a language of literature, law, and government. Intellectuals, poets, and historians look back to this golden age as they worked to create a modern Catalan culture that could stand alongside the great cultures of Europe. The revival of Catalan as a literary language was the movement's central project. For centuries, Catalan had been marginalized, excluded from official use, and dismissed as a dialect of the uneducated. Now poets and writers were demonstrating that Catalan was capable of expressing the full range of human thought and emotion. The Jocs Florals. The Jocs Florals, or floral games, represented the most visible expression of the Catalan cultural revival. These poetry competitions, revived in 1859 after centuries of dormancy, were held annually in Barcelona and attracted poets from throughout the Catalan-speaking lands. By 1870, the Jocs Florals had become a major cultural event. The competition's winners received symbolic prizes of flowers, a natural flower, a golden flower, and a silver flower. But the true reward was recognition as a master of Catalan poetry. The event attracted Barcelona's cultural elite and served as an annual celebration of Catalan identity. The poetry produced for the Jocs Florals often drew on themes of Catalan history, landscape, and tradition. Poets celebrated the medieval counts of Barcelona, the Catalan mountains and sea, and the customs of rural life that were rapidly disappearing in the industrializing world. Literature and publishing. Barcelona's publishing industry supported the Catalan cultural revival even as it continued to produce works in Spanish for the broader peninsular market. Catalan-language newspapers, magazines, and books found growing audiences among the educated middle class. The leading literary figures of the Renaixença were active in Barcelona in 1870. Jacint Verdaguer, the priest-poet who would become the greatest Catalan poet of the 19th century, was beginning his career. Victor Balaguer, poet, historian, and politician, was producing works that celebrated Catalan history and identity while pursuing an active role in progressive politics. The theater provided another venue for Catalan cultural expression. The Teatre Romea and other venues presented plays in Catalan, though the Liceu Opera House remained dominated by Italian and French productions favored by the grande bourgeoisie. Visual arts. Barcelona's visual arts scene in 1870 reflected the tensions between academic tradition and the new currents stirring in Paris and other European capitals. The Llotja, Barcelona's Academy of Fine Arts, trained painters and sculptors in the classical techniques that remained dominant in official art circles. Yet artists were beginning to look beyond academic conventions. Maria Fortuny, the most celebrated Catalan painter of the era, had achieved international fame for his Orientalist and historical paintings. Though he spent much of his career in Rome and Paris, he remained a source of pride for Barcelona's art world. The decorative arts flourished as the expanding bourgeoisie sought to fill their new apartments with beautiful objects. Furniture makers, metalworkers, ceramicists, and textile designers created works that combined traditional Catalan craft traditions with influences from Paris and London. Music. Music occupied an important place in Barcelona's cultural life. The Liceu Opera House was the crown jewel of the city's musical institutions, presenting productions that rivaled those of any European capital. The Barcelona bourgeoisie prided themselves on their musical sophistication, and a box at the Liceu was an essential mark of social status. Beyond the opera, Barcelona supported a rich musical culture. Choral societies known as corps were particularly popular and would grow even more prominent in the following decades. These organizations brought together workers and middle-class enthusiasts in shared musical endeavor, providing a space for Catalan cultural expression and social solidarity. Popular music flourished in the taverns and gathering places of the working-class quarters. The habanera, a musical form brought back from Cuba by sailors and returning colonists, had become deeply popular in Barcelona's maritime neighborhoods. Architecture. Barcelona in 1870 had not yet witnessed the architectural explosion that would make it famous in the following decades. But the foundations were being laid. The buildings rising in the example combined classical influences with practical adaptations to Barcelona's climate and building traditions. Josep Oriol Mestres and other architects were designing buildings that would shape the emerging modern city. Their work balanced the grandeur expected by wealthy clients with functional considerations of light, ventilation, and the Mediterranean lifestyle. The seed of what would become Catalan modernisme had not yet sprouted, though the cultural conditions that would nurture it were developing. The combination of industrial wealth, Catalan cultural pride, and openness to European influences would soon produce one of history's most remarkable architectural movements. Chapter 6. Challenges and Transformations. The Specter of Cholera. Barcelona lived under the constant threat of epidemic disease, and cholera was the most feared killer. The disease had swept through the city repeatedly in previous decades, most devastatingly in 1854, when thousands had died. In 1870, the threat remained ever present, and municipal authorities struggled with inadequate resources to implement the sanitary reforms that might prevent future outbreaks. The connection between contaminated water, overcrowded housing, and disease was increasingly understood by medical authorities. But translating this knowledge into action required investments that neither the municipality nor the Spanish state was prepared to make. The poor continued to drink from contaminated wells and fountains, to live in conditions that made disease spread inevitable. When cholera struck, it struck hardest at the poor. The working-class quarters of the Raval and Barceloneta suffered the highest death rates, while the wealthy could flee to their country estates until the danger passed. The epidemic geography of Barcelona starkly revealed the city's class divisions. Labor unrest. The late 1860s and early 1870s witnessed intensifying labor conflict in Barcelona. The relative freedom permitted by the revolutionary government allowed workers to organize and strike more openly than before, and they took advantage of this opportunity. Strikes in the textile industry were becoming increasingly common. Workers demanded shorter hours, higher wages, and an end to the abuses of the factory system. Factory owners responded with lockouts, blacklists of union activists, and calls for military intervention. The relationship between the labor movement and the Republican political movement was complex. Many workers supported the federal Republicans, seeing in the promise of a democratic republic the best hope for improving their conditions. Yet others were already moving beyond liberal republicanism toward more radical visions of social transformation. The persistence of slavery. Barcelona's economy in 1870 remained connected to the institution of slavery. The cotton that fed the city's textile mills came from slave plantations in the American South, Cuba, and Brazil. The colonial trade with Cuba and Puerto Rico, so vital to Catalan merchants and manufacturers, rested on a system of forced labor. The abolitionist movement was gaining strength in Spain, but powerful economic interests, including many based in Barcelona, resisted any change that might threaten their profits. The Spanish Abolitionist Society, founded in 1865, included Barcelona members, but faced opposition from the commercial and industrial establishment. This moral contradiction, a city that celebrated liberty and progress while profiting from human bondage, would not be fully resolved until slavery was finally abolished in Cuba in 1886, and the colonial system itself collapsed in 1898. Environmental degradation. Barcelona's rapid industrialization was taking a heavy toll on the natural environment. The rivers flowing down from the hills, once sources of clean water and power for small mills, were becoming open sewers carrying industrial waste to the sea. The air in the factory districts was thick with coal smoke and cotton fibers. The countryside immediately surrounding Barcelona was being transformed as the city expanded. Agricultural land gave way to factories, housing, and the infrastructure of a modern industrial metropolis. The pleasant gardens and estates that had once ringed the walled city were disappearing beneath the advancing grid of the example. Those who could afford to do so escaped the city's environmental problems by maintaining summer homes in Soria, San Gervasi, or other villages in the hills above Barcelona. The poor had no such option and bore the full health consequences of urban pollution. Looking forward. As 1870 drew to a close, Barcelona stood at a moment of profound uncertainty. The political future of Spain remained unresolved, with the throne still vacant and Republicans pressing for a fundamental change in the form of government. The labor movement was growing in strength and militancy, raising the specter of social revolution. The cultural revival was transforming Catalan identity, with implications for the relationship between Catalonia and Spain that remained to be worked out. Yet for all the uncertainty, there was also optimism. The walls had fallen and Barcelona was expanding into its new plan. Industry was growing, creating wealth that, however unequally distributed, was raising the general level of prosperity. Education was spreading, literacy increasing, and new ideas circulating through a population eager for progress. The Barcelona of 1870 was not yet the magnificent city of Gaudi and Modernisme that would dazzle the world a generation later. But it was a city in motion, a city of energy and ambition, a city that was learning to believe in its own possibilities. The transformations that would make Barcelona one of the great cities of the 20th century were already underway, visible to those who knew where to look. Conclusion: a city between two worlds. Barcelona in 1870 existed between two worlds. It was still, in many ways, a medieval city of narrow streets and ancient trades, where life moved to rhythms established centuries before. But it was also becoming a modern industrial metropolis, integrated into global networks of trade and communication. Its destiny tied to forces operating far beyond the walls that had once confined it. The people of Barcelona in that pivotal year faced challenges that remain relevant today. The tension between economic growth and social justice, between local identity and wider political belonging, between tradition and modernization. They did not solve these challenges definitively, no generation does, but they laid foundations on which later generations would build. The Barcelona we know today, the city of the Sagrada Familia in the Gothic quarter, of the port and the Ramblas, of passionate Catalan identity and cosmopolitan openness to the world, was already taking shape in 1870. Understanding that year helps us understand not just where Barcelona came from, but the forces that continue to shape its future.